Hi, I'm Jake Silver, a member of Actera's Young Professionals Group and the Program Director for Climate Corps AmeriCorps. Thank you for joining this Action Breakout session with Lauren Ritchie. Lauren is a 20-year-old climate justice advocate and writer from the Bahamas, currently living in New York City, studying sustainable development at Columbia University. Her work prioritizes placing historically underrepresented and marginalized communities at the forefront of the climate movement, which has neglected the voices of people of color for centuries, despite them bearing the disproportionate brunt of climate impacts. She engages with climate action and education through the Eco Justice Project and her podcast, Black Girl Blueprint. She's also a writer and content strategist for Brown Girl Green, a youth ambassador for Plastic Pollution Coalition and Global Wildlife Conservation, and the creator of the panel series Columbia Climate Conversations, which invites activists and scientists of color to speak on topics ranging from agricultural systems to sustainable fashion and disability awareness. She aims to spearhead the shift to value experiential knowledge and narrative storytelling as credible forms of knowledge to combat climate change. And without further ado, here is Lauren.
When I was 15, I witnessed my home, Grand Bahama Island, ravaged by Hurricane Matthew. 3 years later, before we had the opportunity to fully assess the prior damage and even think about beginning to rebuild, Hurricane Dorian tore our community apart yet again. I quickly came to realize that while most privileged people around the world contemplate this existential threat posed by the ongoing climate emergency as a distant warning that can possibly be ignored, or perhaps just simply as a rumor of impending doom, for those who are living in my community in the Bahamas, the climate emergency is already here. Upon moving to New York City in 2018, I experienced this dissonance firsthand. After spending my formative years watching my beloved island crumble around me, I came to find that the faces at the forefront of the climate crisis looked nothing like those suffering back home. Instead, I found that the poster children for the environmental movement consisted of esteemed scientists, academics, and a lot of middle-aged white women on Instagram wandering through farmers markets with grins plastered across their faces and stylish tote bags draped over their shoulders. In my Columbia University courses, I stared Hurricane Dorian in the face once more. Only this time, I no longer had the shared experiences of my community to support me. As my professor fielded eager hands around the classroom, each offering solutions to the environmental issues that the Bahamas faces, the detached, starry little comments of my American classmates rang in my ears, leaving me feeling exposed and, most of all, alienated. In their voyeuristic frenzy, they blurted statistics, climate adaptation policies, and economic plans, but not one of them paused to consider the trauma endured by those who fell victim to Dorian's wrath. In their learned insensitivity, they failed to consider the complex nature of this crisis beyond just their research case study. And it's okay, I reasoned, they just don't get it. They've never supported their best friend and her family through homelessness when their house was flooded beyond repair. They've never been a toddler alone on the highest floor of a swing apartment building, just praying that the infrastructure can withstand the storm. They just don't know any better. But at what point was it my responsibility, as the only Bahamian in the room, to teach them? As a young woman from the Caribbean, now existing within the ivory tower of higher education, I often feel like a bridge connecting my past and my present in the hopes of creating a better future. I experience a very strong sense of duty to ensure that the experiences of my community and communities like mine are integrated into the institutions with the most power to enact change, and that most of all, intersectionality, inclusivity, and nuance are prioritized in climate action for years to come. As someone who has observed society evolve so rapidly and remarkably during my lifetime, I'm so emboldened to spearhead any of these changes that I want to see. I began by founding the Eco Justice Project in 2020 to fill a gap that I noticed in youth climate education. I wanted to share information in a format that was modern, engaging, and above all else, accessible for a wide array of audiences, especially with this being the summer that I was home during quarantine. During the pandemic, I came home to find that a lot of my Bahamian peers didn't know much about the climate crisis, so I wanted to make sure that they were being educated and that there was a way for them to receive this information in a way that felt relatable to them. Especially as an avid and critical user of social media, I crafted a narrative which transformed climate change from this obscure buzzword to more of a digestible issue, integral to all of our daily lives. Through infographics, interviews with activists, and blog posts on topics ranging from eco-fascism to fast fashion, I roused my Bahamian peers and American classmates alike to recognize climate action as a universal responsibility and to get involved. During that same year, I also created Columbia Climate Conversations, which is a panel series at my university to engage the undergraduate community with perspectives of women climate scientists and environmental activists of color, speaking on issues ranging from agricultural systems to sustainable fashion and disability awareness. Especially as often the only Black woman in a lot of my classes, it was very important for me within the environmental department that I'm in that the professors, especially ones who are doing work in these communities, are hearing from these communities firsthand. And through this panel, operating within this nexus between the social and the scientific, I use the storytelling narrative that the panel format allows to facilitate a dialogue between climate scientists and those that they've historically neglected. And similarly, in my work consulting on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives here at Columbia's Earth Institute and the Climate School, I made sure that the stories of marginalized communities are prioritized in the university's environmental justice curriculum and educational event planning for more and more years to come. And finally, through my podcast, Black Girl Blueprint, one of the first long-form platforms of its kind, I'm able to share the experiences and the stories and highlight the accomplishments of Gen Z Black girls in a wide array of fields, especially in format like podcasting that doesn't typically cater to this demographic. So all in all, through this use of virtual advocacy, this is how I choose to make my mark. I want to be a part of leading the next wave of climate advocacy, which places women of color at the forefront of a movement which has historically and still continues to tell us that our experiences and stories do not matter. And don't get me wrong, it's not easy work for any of us, especially speaking for myself as a Black woman in predominantly white environments, a full-time college student with grad school aspirations, and of course, we cannot forget the global pandemic looming over us all. At the end of the day, the question remains, how do we stay motivated to keep striving to make a better world despite all the obstacles that are being placed in our path? In short, how do we keep going and what can we do to take action? There are a lot of ways to get involved when it comes to climate issues, and I'm a very, very firm believer that the first step always begins with education, and that means educating yourself as well as educating others. This is especially important when it comes to understanding the links between systemic social issues and climate disasters, especially understanding that the climate crisis goes beyond just the direct impacts that it has on the natural environment. And for this, it's so essential to make sure that you're seeking out a variety of well-rounded perspectives on these issues, especially coming from people who have lived through these experiences and have lived in these communities. And there's an abundance of resources, articles, documentaries, infographics, what have you, explaining a lot of the nuance when it comes to these issues, from sustainable fashion to agricultural systems to housing justice and disability justice. There's a lot going on, so just making sure that you're aware, you're researching these issues, and educating yourself so that you can spread awareness to others. And once you've begun this ongoing research process, now comes the time to figure out how to get involved, or what are the best ways to take action. And there's really no one size fits all when it comes to advocacy work. I think for some people it looks like volunteering in environmental organizations, or participating in demonstrations, or virtual advocacy, or even just taking the steps in your daily life to be more sustainable and thinking about the earth. There are many, many ways to get involved, but one way to start could be looking at local initiatives in your area that might be accepting volunteers, or even just seeing what issues are going on in your community and talking to your local representatives about them. All in all, it's just about finding a way to take action that feels right for you and your interests, your strengths, and just being dedicated and motivated to make this change. And finally, most important, I think, is remembering that as aspiring change makers, resistance is definitely one of our areas of expertise. However, we often don't think about listening to our bodies and our minds as a form of resistance in and of itself. I think we get very wrapped up in the habit of commodifying ourselves in order to be the most productive possible, and we just start to aim higher, we dream bigger, we push ourselves harder because we're just so desperate to believe that our efforts are making a difference. We're terrified of what the state of the world would become if we just paused to catch our breath. So we forget about the communities that brought us to this work in the first place, and that protecting the planet begins first and foremost with protecting ourselves. So, in other words, be kind to yourself, be dedicated, and just note that even in this world that feels so fast paced and demanding most of the time, any incremental impacts that we can make towards a more sustainable and just future are still very, very worthy of celebration. Thank you.